Hello, Katya. How are you today?
I am good, thank you. Lovely to be here.
So we just had a so-called summer. I mean, it wasn't much of a physical summer, more of a metaphorical summer. But then, this summer and last summer have been a bit crap, as in, we've all been locked down and been forced to kind of contemplate.
Yeah, definitely true. Yeah. That's interesting, isn't it? How lockdown has affected us and how it's affected the way we work. Yeah.
Yeah. So, I mean, uh, the way you worked last year is different from the way that you work this year, because of lockdown and so on. Um, what's worked and what hasn't worked in the last year?
Well, that's a really good question. Oh, I love that question. Yeah, that's one of my favorite topics because that's a lot of what I talk about and teach about. What has worked and what hasn't worked. I would say that overall, the pandemic, of course, has not been a good thing. It's pretty self-evident. But I think there's a couple of things that we've learned how to adapt. And that's one thing I teach in my training. So one of the things I do is I do workplace resilience training. And that is either workshops or longer term programs. But the message is still the same. How can you work well? And that has adapted a lot in this past year. I think the things that help people work well in the past year is learning to adapt, how we work. So I think there's been a big theme about working from home, and now that's maybe evolved. We're now speaking in September 2021, so that's evolved to more hybrid working for many people. And I think that's probably one of the biggest changes for most people. I wouldn't say it's all. I know a lot of your listeners are clinicians. So there's obviously a cohort of surgeons and intensive care doctors and nurses and other healthcare professionals for whom the work hasn't changed much because there's only a small amount of that you could triage. I know you're a surgeon yourself, so must be a chunk of what you've done that hasn't really shifted because you have to go in to lay hands on the patient in order to perform surgery. For lots of other specialties I work with, general practice, psychiatry and so on, the work has massively shifted because a large part of that work can be done virtually. And so those people have done a lot of work from home. And that has pros and cons. I would say that I think we're probably well versed in the advantages of working from home now. Reduced commute, better for the environment, more time at home, more flexibility. If you're organised, you could fit your Zoom yoga class in on your lunch break, and that is wonderful. I think it's really important to embrace that. I think the flip side of that is especially if you're doing emotionally draining work, which you can do if you're a clinician, psychiatrist, GP, etc. You do that emotionally draining work virtually, and then you finish that work. And if you live alone, or if you haven't planned how you do your work at home, you can sometimes then feel you don't get a chance to switch off in the way you might do when you worked in a workplace. And that's because of something called that's labeled the third space, which is actually the psychological benefit you get from a commute. So there's lots of downsides to commute. So I think we're all versed in that, time, cost, etc. And commuting can be quite stressful, but the advantage is it's the third space. It's not the work, it's not home, it's a third space. And that space allowed us to kind of prepare for work mentally on the way in and then to unwind on the way back. And I think if you don't get that space and you're working from home and you're doing something demanding, emotionally or cognitively demanding, then it's quite difficult to suddenly switch gears. I don't know if you've had that experience. You're doing something working in the home, and then somebody comes in and you get an interruption from family, and that's difficult. Or conversely, you finish your work and you step out the door and suddenly you have to step change mentally into other issues, and that can be difficult. It can mean you don't switch off, and mentally that can be quite tiring. It can mean that you never feel you're off work, and things we do can make that worse. For example, I don't know if you've ever done this, but I used to do this, is you used to wear your home clothes when you're working. You're like, well, nobody will ever know, or I'll just wear the smart top for a Zoom call and my tracky bottoms. That can feel like you're being relaxed, but the flip of that is the same problem, that when you then relax at the end of your workday, you're still wearing your tracky bottoms. So you never really feel you've stopped working. So I think that's one of the big challenges that has come with working from home and hybrid working, is the how do we switch off problem. then there are ways to manage it. One way is just to be aware of what we've discussed, and to, if you're not going into the office, just do something, to a ritual to tell yourself you finished work. You might walk around your garden, walk around the block, change your clothes. So actually now I always wear work clothes for work and home clothes for home if I'm working from home. And that is helpful for people around you as well. So if you live with others, you don't have to walk out of your door and announce you finished work. They can just see that from what you're wearing. So I think,
in my case, I just take my top off once I finished work.
I'm not going there. I'll leave that for the next podcast guest to explore with you.
Yeah. That's my announcement that I've stopped working. I take my top off.
I think the principle is sound, though I wouldn't advocate any particular, removal or application of clothing for any listeners. I'll leave that to your judgment. But I think the principle is really helpful. And I think the other thing that's helpful is thinking about your other tasks outside of work. So it's really obvious if you're going into your workplace, then you're not there, right? You're not at home. Somebody else has to do that stuff. And when you're at work, you're fully at work. I think there can be a problem, especially if you have children, especially if you haven't planned or you haven't had the money or the time or any other practical reason, just to sort out tasks. And a big one is childcare, especially with homeschooling and the pandemic. That can be a big burden, because then you end up trying to multitask. And as we all know, multitasking is a fallacy. It's impossible to do two things at once unless they're both habituated. Like, I guess you could theoretically walk and brush your teeth because they're both habituated, but anything more cognitively demanding, you can't do it. You have to switch your attention from one to the other. So trying to say, oh, do a bit of work while the kids are playing, it's not a long-term strategy. We've all done it for short-term issues and so on. I think in the long term, that can be really draining. And often in today's society, despite all the many advantages, that still sometimes I think does land at the door of a female worker more than a male worker. Not always, but sometimes. And I think it's important to be clear about that and plan ways to prevent that happening, because short-term, whatever, we just get on with it. Long-term, it can be very draining. And then there's guilt and other factors that come in, that you're not doing either role properly. And for you, the individual, it can be intellectually draining and emotionally draining. So I think those are some of the big challenges that have arisen in the pandemic. I guess.
Do you see this changing over the next year? Because COVID is going to stay with us, and the way that they're dealing with COVID, i.e. restrictions and lockdowns and masks and sort of all these antisocial measures. Do you think we're going to kind of adapt more and more and be more, what's the word, like a chimera of skills?
Yeah, I wonder that. I think that's another wonderful question. I would say yes, but probably less. Yes, to an extent. Yeah. And I'm saying that as just an instinct based on what has happened in the past 18 months. I remember 18 months or 2 years ago, the big thing people were talking about or thinking about was flexible work. Is it okay? Can we change the culture? So working from home a few days at home, a few days in the office is okay. And now that's a done deal. Everybody from. But
is it sustainable? That's my that's my question. Is it? Because healthcare is complicated, and the way that delivering traditional Western healthcare provisions, it's not getting simpler; it's getting more complicated.
Yeah,
and also patients are much more informed about their conditions. The information is much more available, and that yet we have a lot more juggling to do as healthcare professionals. So. I guess the question is, the traditional model worked for a long time, but have we passed that stage of traditional healthcare delivery? For me, I'm still delivering healthcare traditionally. I'm still actually, I've done no virtual profession. Well, except for psychotherapy and psychoanalysis, but in terms of surgical and sort of medical delivery, that's all been face to face, and nothing much has changed. And I hope I'm not missing anything. With you guys delivering everything in a hybrid and virtual way.
Yeah, I don't know. I think it is a bit horses for courses, isn't it? I mean, like surgery, this is my view, surgery is by definition a practical, hands-on, in real life specialty. So that's probably
I mean, robots will come in eventually.
I was just thinking that as I said it.
And, they will have remote surgical centers where, they do the operation, and if need be, the old gray-haired surgeon will sort of come in and finish off the complicated operation, I guess.
Interesting.
That's sort of going forward. But, in other parts of the world, they deliver healthcare in a very traditional way. And I guess it's still working to a certain extent.
I think there's something about the human connection that's really important to being a healer or a doctor or nurse or all of that. And I think there are ways to manage that virtually. That's something else I do in some of my workshops, actually, how to connect virtually. But nonetheless, it's still much more natural and important to do human real life contact where possible. I think your broader question about what's going to happen in the future, I don't know, but my instinct is some things will stick, because it's been long enough now as a society that in the UK that we've shifted things. I appreciate other countries that's not had so much lockdown. I'm thinking particularly of New Zealand as we speak. Their culture may not have shifted much at all because it hasn't had the pressure of lockdown to make it happen. I'm guessing that some things will stick and some things will shift, and some of it will be about practicalities. Some of it, as you rightly said, will be driven by patients. And there's a cost factor as well. I think lots of maybe thinking outside of sort of healthcare delivery now, but other workplaces, it's a lot cheaper if not everyone's in the office all the time. It's much, and you can, if you get the balance right, you can actually get better work. You can get the benefits of in face-to-face, everyone in the office a couple of days a week. They get the contact and the brainstorming, all that human wonderful connection, but they get distracted, because that's what you do when you chat around the photocopier. And if you give your workers a couple of days a week to be at home, they can maybe do that deep dive focus work. And if you get that team working well together, that can be a really good model, depending on the work that's being delivered. So I think there might be a hybrid of sorts going forward. And I like to think there are positive ways to make that happen. We haven't got all the time in the world. We were talking earlier about how I like to chat, so I can talk about this for probably half day because it's one of my favorite subjects. I've done a little ebook actually, so if anybody wants to know more, they can just go to my website workingwelldoctor.com, and it's totally free. An ebook. It's called How to Work Well from Home, and it's got some of these ideas in a bit more depth and a few more tips and strategies. I actually wrote it in the first lockdown, kind of for myself, because I don't know if you did, most of us, or maybe you didn't because you just said you didn't work virtually, but literally first lockdown, none of us had really thought much about it. It was summer, I remember, and I was like, oh, I'll just take my laptop, put it in the kitchen, carry on working. Did not think any more than that. Wondered why I got interrupted, got headaches and got a neck ache. And I was like, hang on a minute, I'm an occupational health doctor as well as a GP. I should think about this from an occupational health point of view. So I was like, okay, fine. So I'm in a really hot kitchen with lots of windows in summer. There's no curtains. I'm getting headaches. I'm wearing my sunglasses at work, looking at the screen. I'm getting totally glared out. And I'm wondering why I'm interrupted by the microwave and the blender. And I was like, this is just stop this. So I invested in a screen. You might just have seen it actually, which I put up. Didn't cost me much and saved me lots of headaches because it gave me a bit of shade. And I thought more about where I was sitting. So now I don't use a laptop, I use a desktop because I'm less hunched over. And again, hunching over for a short while, whatever, we've all done it, sitting on the sofa like this. But I'm just scrunching up for those listening rather than watching. But over time, over the months and years, it can become problematic from musculoskeletal point of view. Again, it's not going to maybe be the most serious health condition you're ever going to have, but it can actually be quite distracting and troublesome, and that can affect your performance and focus. And there's a peak in people sort of going to their GPs about musculoskeletal aches in the first lockdown as well. So I think thinking about stuff, it doesn't all have to be rocket science, but if you don't plan it, then you don't do it, and then over time it can have longer term consequences. So I just thought, what am I doing? I'm being a crazy bean here. I wasn't thinking about this properly. So I put these thoughts together in this ebook. So grab it if you'd like. It's got some of these ideas and more, totally free, just to help out.
What's the best idea that you have in the book that you can share with us today?
I don't know, they're all amazing.
that really
Actually,
worked for you during the first lockdown?
for me personally, I think boundaries is the best idea for me, and that's because it's something I am always working on. I like to talk, I like to help, I like to say yes to everybody, and that's not possible. And it's even harder if you're trying to work from home, because it's just literally not possible to say yes to different roles you might be having. And it's no good for you, it's no good for the people who are trying to sort of work with or interact with, or family members. So the stuff I just said at the beginning about boundary rituals, I really had to practice that and make it into a habit for me. So like I said, in the first lockdown, I think I'd wear tracksuit bottoms or leggings with a just to work and not think about it. And now I don't do that. I'm literally wearing my entire work clothes, right down to my work shoes, though nobody is going to see my feet. I know I'm wearing them. So it all helps me remember. And then I will take those shoes off later when I finish this podcast and other bits of work. I find it quite helpful, actually. So I'd say, boundaries. And there's lots more to boundaries, but you have to give yourself permission, and you have to be prepared to, say yes to some things and no to others. There's a lot of decision making that sits behind a boundary, but important, I'd say.
Yeah. I mean, when did you realize that sort of boundaries was the key issue in your professional development?
Oh, I like that. Can tell you're a coach. We were talking about this before, weren't you? I think it links
it's just random questions,
No,
really
it's not random though, is it? It's all bubbling away in your brain. There's all these links you're making. Not random at all. I think it is a really good question, because I think it does link to, I don't know about any people listening, but I think if you're a clinician, or you, I don't know if you find this, part of what took most of us to medicine or nursing or other healthcare, or even broader caring professions, we want to help, right? By definition, you want to help. That's amazing. Good for you, good for the people you're helping. The problem is you can't do that forever, or unless you pause and look after yourself as well. Just you can't sustain it. And I intellectually understood that, and emotionally failed miserably for many years, and ended up with burnout. And I think that is, for me, that was the real reason why I ended up in burnout, is that I didn't really emotionally give myself permission to set boundaries. So I was always trying to care for everybody, and didn't really have space for any sort of self-care, and that is not sustainable. And burnout is quite rubbish, actually. People use it a lot, and I guess I'd call that another silver lining of the pandemic, that the stigma around burnout is probably diminishing, though the corollary is that that's because there's more burnout happening, which is really awful. And it's horrible. Burnout is really horrible. It's really debilitating if you have, quote, proper burnout. Not that other people use burnout to mean lots of things. If you look on the sort of geeky ICD, I think 10 classification, ICD-11, it's got 3 factors to be burnt out. You need to have emotional distance from your work, feel tired all the time, not feeling better after a holiday or a weekend, assume you're not working the weekend, and then have poor performance. And often for competent, conscientious people, the first 2 things happen for quite a long time, and you know that you're struggling, but people around don't. And then at some point you just run out of steam, and then your performance drops off, and that's even worse for you and for the people around you. And it's all quite a difficult cycle. And it takes a while to come back from. Sort of with my occupational health hat on, that kind of burnout, you require sort of rehabilitation or recovery time, and often you need some time off work.
Sort of how long on sort of average what do you say does it take in terms of time off?
I mean, obviously it does depend on the individual, but I'd say we're talking more like not just 1 or 2 days or 1 week. We're talking weeks or months. Hopefully not, months and months, because there's also evidence that the longer you take off work, the harder it is to return to work. So
what's the kind of sweet spot time?
It depends on the individual. You'd want from a couple of months. And I think it's just a question of listening to yourself, keeping in touch with your healthcare provider, GP, occupational health doctor, whatever, if that's where you are, and making sure you're getting the support you need, and people check in with you, and so you can gradually get better.
Do you want to share what happened to you? And
I think I kind of just did. Yeah, so very much basically what I just described is what happened to me. Often there's lots of other factors happening, which I think we probably all see in our clinical practice when people are poorly. I don't know if that happens so much in surgical specialties, but often sort of for things where there's a mixture of mental and physical health issues, often there's a combination, and there's like a crisis point where lots of factors combine and then symptoms get worse. And yeah, that happened with me. There was issues of sort of, there's some bits and bobs going on at work and a fair few things outside of work, and it just was, and you can, like I was just saying before, you can sustain that because you're hopefully competent, conscientious, and so on. And willpower essentially can get you quite a long way, but at some point you can't continue. So yeah, that was really difficult. And at the time that happened to me, that nobody was talking about burnout then, and I don't think I really even knew what it was. It was just, oh, I'm off sick, it's been a bit stressful, that kind of thing. But looking back, I was like, no, this is what happened, I would say. I was going to say something else, it just slipped my mind.
Because I met you at an event that I organised.
Oh yeah.
I think a couple of years ago.
Yeah, I don't think I was in burnout then. I think I was a bit too perky because I remember taking the train to come in to your conference, which was very good, really cool.
But you were very tentative, and you were very attentive, and you were thinking a lot. I could see a lot of things going through your head.
Yeah, well, hopefully lots of us do that. It's good to think. But yeah, no, I think it does take some time to reflect, actually, to get to your point. You do have to reflect and process things. And at the time, this was was before the pandemic. Yeah. So now people talk a lot about burnout, but when I was having burnout, there wasn't so much dialogue about it. Yeah. Definitely not for people I knew personally, or even sort of on social media. There was no professional people saying this is what happened to me. And I just felt really ashamed is kind of the wrong word, but I felt really, maybe ashamed, shamed, embarrassed, like I quote shouldn't have, all those kind of feelings. I think it was more guilty. I felt less ashamed and more guilty. Excellent. And yeah, that in itself is a barrier. It's a barrier to seeking help, and it does delay recovery. It doesn't. So when I got through all that, I was like, this is rubbish. There's the least I can do is try and help people avoid some of the mistakes I made. I mean, here am I, I'm a doctor, I'm an occupational health doctor, and this still happened to me, and I'm a GP. So I know, I quote, know it all, or know as much as another person of those specialties would know. Definitely not all, actually, but know some stuff. And it didn't help. And now I realize there's a lot of doctors like that, and other caring professionals, because we're so busy doing the stuff we talked at the beginning. We're so busy thinking about other people, we don't pause to look after ourselves. And there's a culture of looking after other people. So there's an element that can arise, as it did for me, of feeling guilty. So you might know you need to do it, but then feel guilty about it. And that can be a barrier. And then the pandemic, of course, has brought on so many more pressures, and so much more of these issues have risen for some people. Not all. Some people really love being on the sharp end, and they've really thrived. Some GP practices are doing wonderful work, working together in teams and adapting to all the changes that have gone on when we're working virtually. And some people really haven't. It depends on their teams, their personalities, and where they are in their training and their broader support networks. And it can be really, really difficult. And I just want to do what I can to help people avoid some of the mistakes I made. And that's a large part of why I founded the Working Well Doctor, was just to talk and to try and reduce stigma by talking about these things, and then also give a bit of training from what I've learned and since then. So training about how to maintain resilience at work, which is why I do these workshops. And then I do career coaching as well, because some people just want to consider alternative ways of working. And it's great to have a space to do that. You're a coach, and I've had coaching, and I as well as giving as well as receiving coaching. And I think it's wonderful to have that safe space just to reflect. And so I have those two prongs, the coaching and the training that I do. But it's all rooted in the same idea, is just to help people avoid some of the mistakes I made. So it was not very nice.
Yeah, I mean, cock-ups are great when it's kind of it's all right in the end, so to speak. But when you're going through it, it's pretty horrible, and
It is.
it generates
And
a lot of negative emotions, and that causes a lot of negative psychophysiology within the body, which is never
yes,
great. But then that
yes.
generates the kind of motivation and action in order to change the situation, and allow you to learn new information for you to adapt in better ways.
Yeah, I think so. That's one reason I wanted to do two parts to what I do in the Working Well Doctor, because some people want to do exactly that. They want to be like, okay, I don't want to leave my job. I just want to find a way to make it better. And like, fine, there's training we can do around that. There's also a bit of reality, which is you can't fix everything. I don't want to say that, it's not helpful to go to training, because it is, and resilience training is wonderful, and I love it, and I think it helps. However, it can't fix the pandemic. It can't get rid of the external broader workplace pressures. I don't need to tell you this. You're working as a surgeon at the moment. Some of the stuff about how you work is not within your remit, and even if you can develop yourself and work with your immediate team and patients, that will help you to an extent. But the broader work, the shifts, the demands, the constraints, of
no,
the
I mean, there's
NHS.
a cultural element, and by nature, cultural elements are within a essentially a hierarchical structure which you can't change, and you're in that structure, and it's by definition tyrannical, so to speak. But
That's interesting. I would say,
I mean, it's this dichotomy between culture and nature, and to a certain extent they're both fixed, but you have a bit more say in your nature compared to the broader nature. You have less of a say in the broader culture, but you have more of a say in your own immediate vicinity of culture, which is why, as you said, there is, you can work within teams which are productive and exude wellness. And that's only within smaller teams rather than larger teams, because larger teams, has different cultures.
I love that. Do I agree with all of that? I agree with most of what you said. I definitely think a piece about the stuff you can control is more the local stuff, local to you, local to your teams. And the bigger stuff, sometimes, I think it is important to vote. We can't eliminate coronavirus. We're all working with vaccines. That's wonderful. But there is a virus. There's nobody who can suddenly delete that from, the globe.
I mean, it's a new virus. It's a new virus, which we're learning more and more about. So our body of knowledge is constantly increasing.
Exactly.
And at the end of the day, it is a competition between the virus and our own survival.
It is, isn't it?
Generally speaking, we've been around longer than the virus, and we do have survival mechanisms which are much more powerful than the small virus, which isn't very effective on human beings, because 99% of human beings live quite well after being infected by the coronavirus. So
I hope it is 99% now.
Probably a lot more.
More than before the vaccine.
So that's the kind of body of knowledge that we have, and if you put things into perspective, and if we don't just step on the the negative emotional bandwagon that a lot of the mainstream media use, and unfortunately a lot of the political organizations and institutions, they use a lot of that negative energy and negative emotional power in order to exert their own agendas and sort of particular narratives.
Tricky, that, isn't it?
So I mean, it's important to separate the two between biology and non-biological states.
I think I think that is interesting.
But I mean, having said that, psychology is a biological state. So, they are using biology in order to control biology. So they're using the, metaphysical, psychological states in order to control so-called physical states. But I mean, it's
you're talking about politicians now when you
something
say
like
they.
Yeah.
You're talking about wow, this is deep stuff.
Well, we're all politicians, really. We're all there trying to change. We're all there trying to change people's mind, people's politics. At the end of the day, it's interesting
that actually. Are we all politicians? Yes, I think maybe the broader point. I think everything you said, I don't agree with every detail you said, but most of it I think I do. And I think one thing you're right about is this: we're all politicians. I was thinking about that when you said you can't change the culture at work, and I'd say yes, I would agree in a short term, a week, a month, but broadly, I think we can change culture. Conversations like this will hopefully change culture. And then we both go back to other people, and it's a network and a conversation. I think over time, culture can shift in workplaces.
I mean, the thing about culture is that it's got to be functional and it's got to work. So at the moment, the culture that's prevailing on a broader sense works to a broader extent, which is why it's prevailing. But then if you maintain that culture, it becomes tyrannical, and then it becomes abusive. So coming back to our point, if you change your immediate environment, whether that's your family, your workplace, your immediate community, and even your subspecialty or your particular field in the profession, that's where you can make a massive difference. But obviously it starts from the individual. And I wanted to come back to the question, so you realized that you were burnt out. What was the first thing that you did? And, that made a profound difference into your state of coming out of burnout.
Oh, gosh, that's a really good question. What was the first thing? I think probably the first thing is this thing about permission, which we've touched on briefly. I feel quite passionate about it. I've written a few articles and so on. So there's blogs on my website and stuff if you want to read more about permission. But yeah, I think that probably is the nub of what changed for me was giving myself permission to say, this is not good. This is a bad situation. I have to do something differently. And I'm kind of got a reasonable idea of what to do because, background in healthcare and medicine and whatever.
So what made you brave enough to do it? What gave you that courage to do it?
That's such a good question. Yeah, back to being a coach. I can tell your coaching skills coming out. What made me brave enough to do it? I think there's an element of necessity. I think that's probably I think it was partly this realization. It was I think for a long time it was, I'm struggling, but I'm still, everyone else is doing all right, and I can keep this up. And then that stopped working. And I was like, I thought I could do this, but I actually can't. And I was wrong. So I think you have to just acknowledge what I was saying earlier, that, none of us have infinite resources and we all have a limit. And therefore you have to look after yourself and think of strategies. Otherwise you can't sustain things. I didn't know that. I had to learn it the hard way. And I think that essentially is the switch that got flipped. It was I can do this. I'm struggling, but I'm managing, to, I can't do this. I am no longer managing. This is rubbish for me. It's rubbish for people around me.
Could you give us a story of when, what happened? Was there a particular narrative, or like a patient came in with, I don't know, broken leg, and you thought,
just like, I can't fix this anymore? No, nothing like that. But I don't remember actually, which might be a sign of how overwhelmed I felt at the time. But I do remember had this feeling actually, and that was a feeling that I talk about, and I think it gets to one of those definitions, a feeling of just, I can't, whatever this patient is going to come in with, they haven't walked in the door yet, pre-COVID, haven't walked in the door yet, whatever they say, I can't hear it. I mean, intellectually, my brain and my ears are still working, but emotionally, I don't have space to listen to any more problems because my capacity is used up. And that feeling was when I was like, I need to take a break from clinical practice. I can't be working. This is not part of your role as a clinician. There's an assumption, and it's a fair one, made by your bosses and your patients, that you will be able to listen and you're willing to listen and try to help. And I am that person. But to find that there was a moment in my life when I wanted to be that person, but I just didn't have the capacity for it, was really quite distressing and upsetting. And also ethically, I was like, I need to take a break. I can't be working right now. You've got to be fit to work. And that at that moment, so I was like, I need to take a break. So I took a break and so forth. But that emotional feeling is, I think, what they're talking about, in that sort of dry definition of burnout. They talk about emotional distance from your work. And there's various ways that can manifest in the individual person who's in burnout. Sometimes it might be cynicism, people going, oh yeah, about the other, about the patient or whatever, or about the person who's seeking help. And other times it can be different. And for me, it wasn't really cynicism. It was just a sense of, I just can't do this. And that, yeah, it was difficult. It was a difficult moment, but I think it was quite pivotal in the way you've asked. Good question, Hader.
Oh,
yeah.
Yeah, it's difficult, and I remember when I burnt out when I was in Iraq at the time, and yeah, I just didn't care about the cataract. You know, the patient's got a cataract. I thought, oh, fuck this, you know. I don't give a shit.
Interesting. Yeah, so that
You're
is that
seeing
emotional
someone
distance
else
again, isn't it? Yeah,
you know, go and see
exactly
someone else. And then, you know, that patient was shocked. And, you know, we've got a tribal system in Iraq. So the patient called my my uncle, you know, who's the head of our tribe. And then he called me up and he said, hi, I need to speak to him and speak to you. And I sort of saw him and goes, look, the patient came to you and you sent him away. You said, oh, I can't do this. Go and see someone else. And, you know, that was like the realization that, yeah, I'm kind of a bit messed up here, you know.
Yeah.
You know,
yeah,
you know, the technical word is, you know, I'm a bit fucked up. But I'm not allowed to say the F word, you know, because my colleagues at work think it sort of reduces my professionalism. Anyway, so, you know, that
I could see
yeah,
that.
you know, that was my realization that, oh, I'm burnt out. I need to change things. And, you know, the first thing I did was, you know, sort of stop working for probably like a month. I took a month off just to reevaluate. And, you know, I realized that actually I'm not, you know, ophthalmology is nice, but I don't think it's me anymore. I think I've got to pursue other stuff that I find just as fascinating. And, you know, that's when I went into the world of woo-woo and the metaphysical.
And so this podcast was born.
Well, yeah. Well, you know,
book and everything.
Yeah. I mean, I started listening to podcasts just to kind of expand your horizons of awareness and interest and novelty.
Yeah, I did that as well, actually. I think podcasts are a really good thing to do if you're a bit low on resources. You can just listen. So I listened to lots of positive podcasts, ideas, exactly like you said, not just doctors but others.
I mean, I listen to history. So there's a podcast called Hardcore Histories by Dan Carlin. Really fascinating.
I'll have a listen.
And yeah, hardcore histories. And I realized that you know, because I thought I was so special, you know, and I was, you know, in the center of the universe, and I'm such a wonderful man and a wonderful surgeon, and just, do you know what I mean? And then I realized that no, it's you're not. You're just like any other Tom, Dick, and Harry, and they've been through what you've been through, and they've suffered as much as you've suffered, and, you know, they went through so much more hurt than the hurt that you're experiencing, and it sort of just calmed me a bit, you know, that I don't need to be too you know, have too much existential angst and dread. So anyway, you know, I mean, let's not get you know, too deep with this, because we're coming towards the end of the podcast. I mean, I like to finish with this, which is so, you know, if we can go back to Katya, who's about to start her medical training, which medical school did you go to?
I went to Imperial.
Imperial.
London.
So, you know, you're about to start Imperial. You're thinking to yourself, yeah, that's it. The bees and knees. I'm here in Imperial. We're the best. I mean, I was at Bart's, so, you know, we had no respect for you whatsoever.
Yeah, tell me about it. Oh, if I'd known that at the beginning of this podcast, we'd had a different conversation.
Yeah. So, you know, we don't consider you, you know, as a medical school, or actually existing anyway.
Thanks. Same to you. That's another whole conversation. That's funny.
So,
cool.
given that, you've got competition down the road, you've got Kings down the road, you've got Barts, somewhere else, you've got guys as well, right? So now that you've been through what you've been through, over the last 5 or 6 years being a doctor, because you are so young, what would you tell
Thank you for
Katya?
that.
Yeah, so you're having a coffee with her and what have you. What would be your 3 top tips to her?
Gosh, that's a good question. No, there's been no priming for this, listeners. I didn't know this question was coming. I'm thinking on my feet now. Top tips. I think the permission is actually, for me personally, that was probably really important. If I'd known that earlier, I might not have burnt out. So yeah, permission. And I think boundaries.
Permission for what?
Permission to do what I ended up doing in the end, but I could have just done it a lot earlier.
Right.
So if I just instead of waiting till I got really burnt out and then saying, no, I need to look after myself as well, if I'd just done that all along, then I probably would have just been okay. I'd have carried on doing some work and spent more energy thinking about and looking after myself, and that probably would have been a lot more sustainable and a lot less painful. And I think something about boundaries is part of that, because I used to be and like I said, I still like to do that, but I think where you sort of listen and try and help everybody, and that's really wonderful. But I think it's about being more self-aware about when you're doing it, how much can you actually do with this, and when do you need to start working on boundaries.
I mean, how do you translate to a 18-year-old young woman boundaries?
I think it's not that difficult. I think I think you just need to just be clear about what you need and what you like to do, and then plan. Some of it's just about planning, saying, okay, what do you want to do? How are you going to set this up? Because by setting it up, you set up structures, and within those structures are going to be boundaries. It's not about saying no to everybody. It's just about being clear. I think this is what I need. This is what I'm trying to do. This is how I can do it. I can do these things. I can't do these things. Just that kind of mindset. And I think there's something you just touched on as well. The third thing, I think, is about stories. We both just said in our own way how we listen to podcasts and it helps us when we're in a tough spot. And that's, you listen to history, I listen to podcasts about more current people who are alive now. But I think it's all about human stories. And one thing I really love about being a GP is that you listen to lots of stories. And now in my other work, I write more. And I think there's something really important about human stories. It gives us context. It lets us make sense of the world. And I think there's something about being a healer where you listen to stories, and being heard, telling your story, listening to other stories is really helpful for humans in general. And I think there's something that's wonderful about that. And you can do that through medicine, you can do it outside of medicine, but listening to your own story, listening to other people's stories is what weaves us together as a society and allows us to get a sense of who we are. So I think that would be my third thing, would be listen to stories.
Healing stories, good stories, bad stories, all kinds of stories, and it gives us context and perspective in our own stories.
Yeah, I would definitely say that. And I've just read a couple of books by Matt Haig, who's written about this, and he was saying one way he got through his depression was by just reading lots of stories. And even when you're feeling down, they kind of provide an escape away from there's lots of benefits, and we're all humans living our stories. That's essentially what we're doing on the planet, aren't we? Just writing our story every day. So I think there's something about that. So boundaries, permission, and stories. There you go.
Awesome. Well, it's been a great pleasure listening to you today, and I hope it hasn't been too stressful or traumatic.
No, it's been really nice to have a chat,
having this conversation. And how can people get hold of you? What's the best way?
So you can find me on my website, workingwelldoctor.com. There's stuff there about my coaching and training. Also, if you wanted to get that free ebook, just head to the website. You can email me on the workingwellexperience@gmail.com. And I also write quite a lot of these ideas. I write in a blog, which comes out a couple of times a month. But the first place and the best place to get it is through my Thrive Well emails, where I put some ideas and also links, useful ideas, things coming up, discounts, anything fun and interesting, basically, put in that email. So if you're interested in joining, it's a fun community. There's a Facebook group as well. so people can kind of share ideas. And if you're interested in that, just head to the website and you can join the Thrive Well. I think there's a little button there saying Thrive Well News, or you can just email me. I'd love to hear from you. Or there's social media as well. The Working Well Doctor, I think, is the social media.
Yeah, I was on your Thrive Pod kind of live Instagram.
Yeah, you were a few days ago. It's good to see you.
Yeah.
And lots of people watch them back later as well, which is quite fun. That's what I tend to do with these, is sometimes you can get onto them live and sometimes you listen back or watch back later, which is quite fun.
I think I talked about stripping in that one, didn't I? Sort of stripping and
I can't remember, genuinely, thank goodness. That's for the next podcast guest.
I need to sort out my six-pack then.
Goodness me, that's funny. Thank you, Hader. I've really enjoyed just having a chance to chat and reflect on some of these really interesting ideas. And
well, let's do it again. Let's do it again.
Yeah.
And you know, I'm sure we can, you know, do some interesting work together.
Yeah, absolutely. That'd be really good fun. So thanks a lot. Much appreciated.
All right, Katya, take care.
Take care. Bye then.